let's continue on with our series talking about hidden truths. Again, this is all about really understanding a side of the story that wasn't told. This is not about discrediting anything or anyone, and it's truly to bring forth more love into your life, to bring forth more compassion, more patience, more understanding for who you are, for that intuitive side of you, that side of you that says, I know something's a little bit off or a little bit different than what I've been taught. So let's get started. Before we ended our last session, we talked a little bit about art and how women were, and how many people in the world were illiterate, and so art was a big way for things to be portrayed, and how women were taken out of the story of the Christian story, of the early Christ story, in the art. And so we will go on from there into just talking more about the history and the impacts of being a woman and how the roles were downplayed. And then we will, I wanted to get to the next page quickly, and then I'll just read a little bit more about what it was like to be a woman in those times. And then you can see that sometimes some things have changed, some things haven't. But again, this is not to spread any challenges or mean perspectives or hate. This is all about just understanding another side of the story that hasn't been told. Okay, so the expansion of Christian history, particularly for women, is necessary as the modern day interpretation of historical biblical works automatically assumes the predominance of men. Okay, so let me pause there. Since many of us were taught that it was men who wrote the stories and men who told the stories, and today it's in many cases still men who tell the stories, it's typically seen as predominantly male. As Harvard research professor of divinity, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza explains, misinterpretation of women's roles in the early Christian movement reduced the influential role of women. She provides specific examples from the Bible of influential women in the early Christ movement that male scholars have downplayed. Here I will reference one example. In Romans 16:1-3, Phoebe is called the diakonos, or I'm butchering this word, protitius of the church at Syncretia, which translates to deacon. Yet since she is a female, they translated the deacon role as servant, helper, or deaconess. Okay, so what it's saying there is that because of the male interpretation and the male perspective that women could not be deacons, as it was interpreted, she was not seen as a true deacon. She was seen as the servant, the helper, or the deaconess, something that is not fully the deacon. Also, there are many, many accounts of powerful women within the Bible. It's just not portrayed. If modern day interpretation is skewed to patriarchal perspectives that women did not hold high positions in the church, then could writers of the New Testament also have held patriarchal beliefs that impacted their translation and writings? And I question this because, as we know, these books were translated in many cases, in many cases, in almost all cases, by men, and men throughout the ages. Not in the early Christ movement, because that's when they were being written, but throughout the ages, these Gospels were translated, again, by men, probably mostly men within the church organization or within king organizations. And so we start to wonder, is it writers of the is translators of the New Testament are they using their patriarchal belief system to see through the lens of how they're interpreting the New Testament? Okay, were the writers even accurately reflecting the history, or rather herstory, of the early Christ movement? So, okay, so again, I'm referencing back to a Harvard research professor of divinity. She claims that since early Christian communities and authors lived in patriarchal worlds, this most likely impacted their writings. She goes on to say that the activity of women in the early Christian movement, it's hard to get to page 7 here, most likely irretrievably, because their involvement was seen as either unimportant or threatening. Okay, let me go back. Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to read that sentence again because I had to switch to the next page and I got sidetracked. So she goes on to say that the activity of women in the early Christian movement is most likely irretrievable because of their involvement was seen as either unimportant or threatening. Again, there were the male powers to be found women to be threatening and did not want them to be a part of the Christ story, the Christian story, which is what we see mostly today. Based on what we now know about the creation of the New Testament, and since this is going over a couple of videos, I just want to make sure that we understand the creation of the New Testament. So let me just gather that one time here. So there was the Council of Nicene. That's when they decided when Easter would be. That's when they decided the creed and the canon. And remember, the creed is we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty. So this was in 325 Common Era, and then in approximately in 367 there was a festival letter, and that listed the 27 books, which eventually became the canon of the New Testament. So we have the canonical version, and then we have what some call the Gnostic versions, and the Gnostic versions were hidden, and they were discovered in a jar in Nag Hammadi in 1945. These are like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary. So we know that the New Testament wasn't the full story. It's literally not the full story because only certain Gospels were chosen to be a part of the New Testament. So it's not the full story. It's only half of the story. And the other half of the story is that God resides within us and that God is good and loving. Okay, so based on what we now know about the creation of the New Testament and the degradation of women, it seems unfathomable that an accurate interpretation of early Christian history could come from the New Testament. Yet many Christians believe that Acts accurately portrays what happened in early Christianity. Given that early Christian authors selected, redacted, and reformulated their sources to conform to the theological interpretations and objectives, understanding the true accounts of early Christian history is difficult. So we know this, right? Women were written out, were drawn out of the early Christ movement. The little information about women within the early Christian movement states that rich women supported the cause through their wealth and homes. So if you read the Bible, they do state that Jesus's movement was funded by wealthy women. Greco-Roman culture and Jewish practices made women inferior to men. So I mentioned this in an earlier video. In those times, in Roman times, women were seen as less than. So women were seen like as equal to slaves. It is possible that the early Christian movement was, this is what I love. Okay, let's get into this. Okay, and again, if you hear the word feminist and it doesn't revolve or doesn't resonate with you, that's fine, just don't use it. But when I think of a feminist, I think of someone who stands up for women. I don't think of it as a bad thing. Anyways, okay. So, is it possible that the early Christian movement was a feminist act? Early Christian communities included women, which was unusual for that time. So Barbara J. McAfee, professor of religion at Marietta College and author of Her Story, affirms this stance in her writing. Some historians argue that women were in the majority in the early Christian congregations. They use comments made by ancient writers who ridiculed Christianity as a woman's religion, and inventories of women's clothing found at early Christian sites as evidence. Okay, this is super powerful and exciting because what we know from based off of anthropology and archaeology and finding women, or I should say archaeology, not anthropology, and finding women's clothing at early Christian sites, we know that women were a big part of the early Christ movement. So, is this, and I'm saying so, my paper is not saying so, so I will try to stop saying so. Is this perhaps why Constantine and the bishops forged one path for Christianity, one without women's leadership? Was the suppression of women by the church due to the fear of the power women held in the early Christian movement? Could this be why the parasitic selection and canonization process was used in developing the New Testament? We must challenge the early Christian movement's patriarchal interpretations and the text of church fathers chose. The process of canonization of early Christian documents was impacted by the polemics and struggle concerning the leadership of women in the church. The canon reflects the patriarchal viewpoints of early church fathers to eliminate women from ecclesial leadership. Okay. Let's talk about this for a moment. That's a lot of words. So we know that women were leaders in the church. We know this. There's history on it. We know that they were bishops. We know that they were healers. And so why were they taken out? And what was the fear, right, of this movement, of this Christian movement here? When we look to uncover the true history or herstory of Christianity, we learn that women heavily influenced the movement. Women traveled as missionaries, preaching the gospel, baptizing and healing others, and were leaders within the movement. Okay, so I want to pause there. So back in those times, it was uncommon for a man to be able to approach a woman. So in order to convert women to the Christ movement, a woman had to be talking to a woman. And so they would often travel in pairs. So there would be a woman and a man. Okay, even with women in the leadership in the early Christian movement, women's roles in the early church were still questioned in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So what we know is that in the 1st century, women were strong in women in leadership. And then in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, as it started to get picked up by the Romans and others, they were questioning, well, no, women can't be of this caliber. They can't be teaching and preaching about the gospel of Christ or of God. Okay, many profess the history of early Christianity with men at the helm and women subordinate to men as accurate instead of acknowledging the outcome of the history of early Christianity as a patriarchal standpoint in which authors of early church writings were against women's leadership in the church. All right, so let's pause there for a second. Women were leaders, bishops, healers. They baptized others. They preached the gospel. So when the the Christian movement was being, again, more impacted by Constantine and moving to a more patriarchal society. And, again, like I said in a previous video, where did the Romans go? It's called the Roman Catholic Church for a reason. We see the exclusion of women, and it becomes an exclusively patriarchal dominated, male dominated experience within the Catholic Church. And I don't want to say within the whole Catholic Church, because there is the veneration of the Virgin Mary. But, in terms of being able to preach and to teach the Gospels. Okay, the patriarchal standpoint influenced the formation of Christian history and the development of the writings chosen for the New Testament. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite books of all times. This is written by Karen King. She's a Harvard professor. And she breaks down the master story. And the master story, right, is the widespread view of early Christian beginnings. And then she talks about the Gospel of Mary. What I love in this book is that in the first few pages of this book, we see the actual writings. The actual writings from 1,500 years ago, okay? Like, we are seeing these writings, okay? There we go. And so we see these writings. Have you ever seen this of Luke, of Matthew? Anything from the New Testament? No, right? So this is what I love, because, we can be one translation away from truth. Okay. So here's the master story of early Christian beginnings. Jesus shared his pure doctrines with his apostles. Okay? Nobody ever said his apostles were all male. Okay, I just want to make sure that that's clear. The apostles preached the gospel across the land. Okay? Again, no one said his apostles were all male. If you're thinking that in your head, that's because of the patriarchal viewpoint and perspective. 3, obstacles arise within Christianity and the pure doctrines are abandoned. She then refers to her perspective on the problems with this master story. First, I love Karen King. Women are missing. It is known that in early Christianity, women held prominent roles such as apostles, teachers, preachers, and prophets. Given the information known now to Christian scholars, King argues for a different perspective of the New Testament and Nicene Creed that defined early Christianity. The New Testament and the Nicene Creed, this is a quote from her book, define Orthodox Christianity not only in the 4th century and beyond, and in previous centuries as well. Okay, so what she's saying is that the New Testament and the Nicene Creed takes over in the 4th century, right? So 325, remember we talked about the Nicene Creed, or the Council of Nicene in 325, Common Era. This is when Christianity starts to take off, if you will. And the church fathers are saying this is the story. The church fathers are saying this is the story. It's men. And it's always been men, right? And then they take that story back instead of telling the true story of what happened within the first 300 years of Christianity. Okay. A story that suited the church fathers, one without women at the helm of the Christian movement. His story of early Christianity written by the historical winners. All right. So here's what I'll say. What we are experiencing right now, just in general, it doesn't matter what time of year it is, there's going to be news written on it. And there's going to be different perspectives of that news. There's going to be different viewpoints of the same events that happen. Now imagine that only one side of the story was told. Imagine that there was only one side of the story. And that's the story that everybody had to believe and that everybody took on. How inaccurate does that feel for you right now? Because you know it's not yours. You know that most likely the story that's being told doesn't truly reflect what everyone is feeling or thinking or believing. And it typically doesn't reflect the whole truth. There's always another side of the story. But what we found throughout history is that the winners of the wars get to tell the stories, right? The winners get to tell the stories. So, hence the New Testament. Hence this kingdom to come that's going to be forever coming, that, we will maybe one day get there in the very far future. Okay, so the other Christian viewpoints deemed not worthy by the church fathers at the formation of the New Testament and the Nicene Creed were largely lost until recent discoveries. And I talked about that with the Nag Hammadi documents. Recent discoveries of early Christian texts have changed what scholars know or thought they knew about early Christianity. In 1896, the book, The Gospel of Mary, let's see. Oh, okay. The Sophia of Jesus Christ, the Act of Peter were discovered. So this is in 1986. Then, as stated previously in this paper, in 1945, a jar of 52 documents of early Christianity was found in the desert of Egypt near a town of Nag Hammadi. Okay, so these, again, still 1,500 years later, these documents, these early documents, there's two variants of the Gospel of Mary. And both of them are actually in here. Both of the versions of the Gospel of Mary are in here. But what we know is that there were these documents. They were not documents. Let's call them what they are, gospels, but gospels, not heretical, right? Heretical. The church fathers called them heretical because they're not canonized, but who chose the canons? The church fathers in the 4th century and beyond. Okay, so the new material from Egypt demonstrates the master story of Christians' origins is not an impartial account of historical reality, but a construction representing the practices and viewpoints of some Christians, but not all. Okay. So we still see this today in Christianity and in religions all over the world. I'm not just saying it's Christianity. But what we see, there's many, many different types of Christians. There's Lutherans and Baptists and Episcopalians and Pentecostals and Catholics and Methodists. There's just so many variants. And what we're referencing here is that at this time, there were just as many viewpoints and perspectives on Christianity, but only one story was being told. And that was to the masses. And people were dying for not believing that story, right? Okay. It can be argued that the Christian perspective claimed as truth for centuries, oh my gosh, I love that, claimed as truth for centuries is not truth, but rather one side of history. The history that the church fathers wanted to be told across the ages without women in leadership. A Christianity with women obedient to their husbands as God's chosen authority, with women prohibited from speaking, teaching, or from exercising any kind of authority in the congregations. A Christianity in which women were discreet, subordinate, and secluded. Okay. Again, this falls right in line with how women were treated in Roman times. And again, it's the Roman Catholic Church that told this story for hundreds of years. And then, of course, there was the Protestant break off, and I'm not going to go into any of that. But What I'm saying here is that there was a reason that they wanted just one side of the story told. And then when these documents came out, it shook their world. The early Christian missionary movement that taught that all Christians are equal members of the community was not tolerated by the religious social structures of inequality that characterized the dominant Greco-Roman society. Okay, so Jesus taught that everybody is equal. He taught, that the first will be last and the last will be first. Like, he was he was your modern day social justice person, right? Like, that's who Jesus was. And this did not fit into the Greco-Roman society at all. There were levels of ranking, there were hierarchies. And so this did not sit well with the Romans. So, there were a lot of Christians at the time, and they were smart leaders. The emperors were smart leaders, and they were like, hey, how do we get them to believe what we want them to believe? So they overtook the Christian movement, and then they changed it. The early Christian movement upset the traditional patriarchal order by allowing Gentiles, slaves, and women to lead Christian communities and be apostles, prophets, and leaders of the church. So do you see how upsetting that could be to a community that uses God to control, that uses power to control, that uses order of dominance? Men are at the top, slaves are at the bottom, women are at the bottom. They do what we're told. You can see how this Christian movement is a complete, flips the times on its head, flips this whole culture upside down. And so you can see how they want to cover it up, right? Because obviously they don't want women teaching. They don't want slaves teaching. No, you have to be of this caliber. You can only be a male. You can only teach if you go through these trainings, right? So they made it a very specific way to become a teacher of God, as opposed to listening to the heart and trusting your intuition and knowing the truth within you. Instead of the true teachings of the early Christian movement being taught across time, patriarchal forms of Christianity that degraded women and the feminine have been taught as Christian history. Oh my goodness. Okay, so lessons. So let's break it down here real quick because, wow, this got really long. So one, right, we know that women and slaves and Gentiles were apostles, they were prophets, they were leaders, they were bishops, they were preachers in the church. We know this. And what happened is this is around the 4th century, so around the time of Constantine, these things started to shift. Constantine was a Roman Empire. They had the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the Common Era. So some people would call that AD, but in academia that's called CE. So in 325 Common Era, we start seeing this very patriarchal story told because we can't have these women and slaves and Gentiles teaching about God. We can't have them believing that they have that power. We have to overtake that power. And what happens to the Romans? We get the Roman Catholic Church. Okay? And women are written out of the story. But guess what? Here we are. And what's happening now is that it's like an internal uprising. And so that's why you see so many transformations of healing that are occurring at this time. Because it's not as though we need an external source to guide us. That's what we were taught. That's what we were told. But if you were to look at these other gospels, God is within. The gospels that were hidden teaches us. This is the exact thing. So the hidden truth is that it's inside of us. That's the hidden truth. That's the whole point. And these gospels that were hidden teach us just that. That God is within us. That the kingdom of heaven is within. And so I love how it all comes together and how it's all coming out. So if you have any questions, write it below and I will get back to you.